Lord to you today. So I invite you to open your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 21. That's where we'll be studying from. I think we're all honest enough and real enough here that we can say that our walk with Christ is not as steady as we would like it to be. We envision ourselves in this nice, even trajectory upward with very little bumps and very little detours along the way, but in reality, it doesn't happen. As many of you have heard me teach about the doctrine of sanctification, when we look at that, it's an up and down graph upwards, and sometimes the dips get low. And I've thought that part of following Jesus is failing. The failure is always our fault. God is not making mistakes. But still, failing is part of the path. Every kid really needs a skinned knee if he's going to grow up and understand life. And it's the grace and kindness of God that shines through all of this that helps us get the full perspective. And this is really where we see David in our passage today. I've titled this sermon, Fear and Feigning, because that is exactly what he's doing in our story. This is not one of those David and Goliath moments. This is one of those real moments in which the Bible acknowledges that David's in a dip. So we're going to study chapter 21, verse 1, all the way through chapter 22, verse 5. And I've got 3 points, 3 headings for the sermon today. Number 1, eating leftovers, 1 through 9. Number 2, acting crazy, 10 through 15. And then living in a cave, 1 through 5. So listen along as I read the text. 21, verse 1. Then David came to Nob to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech came trembling to meet David and said to him, "Why are you alone and no one with you?" David said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king has commissioned me with a matter and has said to me, 'Let no one know anything about the matter on which I am sending you and with which I have commissioned you, and I have directed the young men to a certain place. Now therefore, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever can be found.' The priest answered David and said, 'There is no ordinary bread on hand, but there is consecrated bread, if only the young men have kept themselves from women.' David answered the priest and said to him, 'Surely women have been kept from us as previously, when I set out, and the vessels of the young men were holy. Though it was an ordinary journey, how much more then today will their vessels be holy?' So the priest gave him consecrated bread, for there was no bread there but the bread of the presence, which was removed from before the Lord in order to put hot bread in its place when it was taken away. Now one of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord, and his name was Doeg the Edomite, the chief of Saul's shepherds. David said to Ahimelech, 'Now is there not a spear or a sword on hand? For I brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's matter was urgent.' Then the priest said, 'The sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, behold, it is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you would take it for yourself, take it, for there is no other except it here.' And David said, 'There is none like it. Give it to me.' Then David arose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. But the servants of Achish said to him, 'Is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing of this one as they danced, saying, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s?' David took these words to heart and greatly feared Achish, king of Gath. So he disguised his sanity before them and acted insanely in their hands and scribbled on the doors of the gate and let his saliva run down into his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, 'Behold, you see the man behaving as a madman. Why do you bring him to me? Do I lack madmen that you have brought this one to act the madman in my presence? Shall this one come into my house?' So David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all his father's household heard of it, they went down there to him. Everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented gathered to him, and he became captain over them. Now there were about 400 men with him, and David went from there to Mizpah of Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, "Please let my father and my mother come and stay with you until I know what God will do for me." And he came and left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. The prophet Gad said to David, "Do not stay in the stronghold. Depart and go into the land of Judah." So David departed and went into the forest of Hereth. Now, I remind you where we were last week in chapter 20, looking at this fascinating story between Jonathan and David. And it was this tender scene in which David leaned on his friend Jonathan, who was in the house with King Saul, to really test King Saul and determine King Saul's motives. And Jonathan and David went through with the test, and they verified for sure that Saul had it out for David's life. If King Saul had his way, David would die. And so they have this very tender goodbye at the end of chapter 20, and David leaves. David leaves his job. David leaves his home. David leaves his wife, and David runs. And so where we pick up today is David on the run. He is running, and he comes to Nob. Now, Nob is an interesting town. We don't hear much about it except in this passage. But apparently it was a priestly town. We can tell from this chapter and in the next chapter that there were many priests here. And apparently there was a worship center there. And so David comes, maybe it was on his route, or maybe he wanted to seek the Lord. Maybe he knew someone there. We don't know. Either way, David comes to this town. He flees here after the new moon feast. And Ahimelech appears to either be the main priest or the person whom David could dialogue with, and he's there. And Ahimelech's, the priest's first concern is, "David, why are you alone?" He knows it's the new moon. He knows this feast just happened, and he knows David is one of the king's main men. And David normally leads a host of soldiers, and it's very strange for David to show up here without explanation, without notice, without his band of men. So Ahimelech questions him. He's skeptical. And David answers his question in verse 2. David said to the Ahimelech the priest, "The king has commissioned me with the matter. And he has said to me, let no one know anything about the matter on which I'm sending you and with which I have commissioned you. And I have directed the young men to a certain place." Now, what's your first observation? It's a lie. It's not true. Now, I don't know what your convictions are about lies in wartime. For me, this is part of warfare. Just like, when soldiers kill in battle, it's not murder. It's part of their task. And so I think lying in wartime is not immoral. And so in some sense, this is what's going on. But we also must say, I'm not sure it's a good look for David. I think it's betraying his state of mind as he fibs to God's man. He lies to the Lord's priest, and he makes up a story that somehow God has, or Saul had sent him on an urgent mission, and so that's why he's alone. And he finishes his explanation with a question. He says, "I need some food. I need some bread. What do you have? Can you give me some loaves, whatever can be found?" And the priest answers an interesting way in verse 4 and explains that all he has is consecrated bread. Now, I'm just going to read you some verses from Exodus 25 so you can get the context. Here in Exodus 25 and verse 30, we have the Lord's explanation about the bread. Here, this passage is describing the table to put the bread on and how they should arrange the table. And at the end of that section in verse 30, it says, "You shall set the bread of the presence on the table before me at all times." So part of the furniture of the tabernacle was this table, and fresh bread was to be set out all the time. Fresh bread was to be kept out. Another detail about this bread helps us from Leviticus chapter 24, verse 9, where it says, "It shall be," that is the bread, "it shall be for Aaron and his sons, and they shall eat it in a holy place, for it is most holy to him from the Lord's offerings by fire, his portion forever." So we know the priests were responsible to maintain the tabernacle, to organize the sacrifices, to take care of the details. And part of the blessing and the benefit of doing that job was they got to take the bread that they would pull out after it had been there for a while, and they were to now replace it with the hot bread. They would take the old bread and eat it for themselves, and it belonged to the priests. So what Ahimelech is saying here, all I have is leftovers. All I have is the bread we pulled out. I don't have any other snacks in the pantry. I don't have any other, goodie bags for you to take. All I have is the bread that only us priests are supposed to eat, the bread that's been in the tabernacle before the Lord. That's all I have, David. So you can see the dilemma here. David's hungry. David's the king's right-hand man. David has authority and he's wanting food. And here's the priest who's tasked to manage the things of the Lord. And so they're talking about, is it appropriate for David to eat the bread? Can Ahimelech send the bread with David? So they have this discussion about, has David and his men kept themselves from women? And so you can go back to Leviticus 15 and read all the laws about being kept ceremonially clean before you can engage in the things of the Lord. So we can deduce from all this that Ahimelech is saying, if your men have been kept clean by not being with women, then it's okay. We'll sort of violate one Torah law for the necessity of you having this bread. And David assures the priest that no, myself and my men have not been with women, so it's okay. So the priest, in verse 6, gives him the bread, because there was no other bread. Now, this is a moment in the sermon and in our study through 1 Samuel where we have this fascinating opportunity to turn to Matthew chapter 12 and realize that our own Lord Jesus knew this story. He read his Old Testament. He studied 1 Samuel just like we're doing. And in this conversation that Jesus was having with the Pharisees, he brings up the very passage that we just studied. So in Matthew chapter 12, verse 1, it says, "At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples became hungry and began to pick the heads of grain and eat. But when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, 'Look, your disciples do what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath.' But he said to them, 'Have you not read what David did when he became hungry, he and his companions, how he entered the house of God and they ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those with him, but for the priests alone? Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and are innocent? But I say to you that something greater than the temple is here. But if you had known what this means, I desire compassion and not a sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent.'" Fascinating, isn't it? Here's Jesus dialoguing with the stubborn, cantankerous, tedious Pharisees over myopic Sabbath day rules. And Jesus reaches back into 1 Samuel and says, "Let me tell you about our King David and how he fudged one of the Levitical rules because of the need for bread on his journey." And he said, just like my disciples and I are on the Lord's business and we're going through the fields and we pull some grain as we walk, Pharisees, this is not harvesting. This is not violating the Sabbath. This is us taking the Lord's provision. That's how Jesus understood the story. So we turn back to 1 Samuel, and what does this tell us? It tells us that indeed, David technically broke the rules. It was the priest's bread, not his. But we also know that the Lord designed the law in such a way to teach us how to follow him. And part of following him is to realize that every ceremonial law must be put rightfully in its place. And just like we should violate, or the Jews should violate some Sabbath law to pull an animal out of a pit, so should David take the Lord's provision to nourish himself, even though the bread technically was not his. So the priest gives him the bread. Now let's notice verse 7, a fascinating footnote in our story. Now, one of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord, and his name was Doeg, the Edomite, the chief of Saul's shepherds. So Saul was a king. Saul had many employees, and Doeg was the main shepherd. He was the guy in charge of Saul's livestock. And Saul was an Edomite. Traditionally, Edomites are the enemies of God. They're the descendants of Esau. They live on the cliffs over by the Dead Sea, and they are bitter enemies. You can go back and read the minor prophet Obadiah and learn about the hate between the Edomites and God's people. And there's just this little clue, a little line dropped in the story. Doeg was there. He heard about the dialogue, about the bread, and about what happened. And it's a spoiler alert for next Sunday's sermon. I'm baiting you back. So after we see Doeg, David has another question, verse 8. He says, is there not a spear or a sword on hand? For I brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's matter was urgent. I don't know about you, but I kind of wince. What faithful soldier in his right mind leaves his weapons? I'm not so much struggling with David lying as much as I am. It's just like, David, this is not a good look. So the priest says, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah. He's like, I have that. So we can imagine this huge sword that had been kept and stored by David was a prize among the Israelites. And so a good place to keep it would have been in the tabernacle. It was a way to acknowledge this was this is a remembrance of when God helped us on that day. Ahimelech says, I have this sword. David says, I'll take it. I'll take it. Now, I think it's fascinating here. The commentator Phillips makes a good observation. David's had this sword before. He's used this sword before. It should have reminded him of the Lord's goodness. It should have reminded him of the Lord's protection. It should have reminded him that he's acting differently here in Nob than he did that day in the valley of Elah, when he stood against the entire army of Saul and his brothers and says, I'll go after the giant. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine defying the armies of the living God? And now he's lying to the priest and running. Again, I look at the story, and to me, this is a low point for David. Now, we must say, and I want to inform you that the story I just read you does not interpret itself for us. There's no verse in here that says, and we tell you this story so you can see how David was having a bad day. We're left to interpret the story ourselves. And it's okay if you interpret this story as bravery and not weakness. But as I've engaged to study the text, as I look at the story, especially in contrast with other places where David and Jonathan have shown valor and bravery, I don't see this as bravery. I see this as David is afraid and running. I see a disciple who's terrified. And so I think we can just acknowledge that the Bible is real. The Bible is raw. The Bible is open about what discipleship looks like. The Bible does not condemn David's lies. The Bible does not spank David for acting this way. We're just left with the story. Look at this. And I think that's the point. Being a follower of God, you're going to have moments like this. As I said earlier, discipleship is following. And sometimes we fall. The fall is still our fault. Fear never really honors the Lord. But I don't think it's possible to come to Jesus and follow him on the pilgrim path all the way to our death and never have seasons where you struggle with fear. Never have moments where you act like this. Shouldn't be proud of those moments. But there is an element of comfort to realize discipleship is not knowing everything and not doing everything perfectly, but it is following. Well, let's move on and look at the second point in my sermon. Acting crazy. Well, David runs from Nob. In verse 10, it says he arose and fled that day from Saul. So apparently his time in Nob was nothing more than a pit stop. It was just a duck in and go. David was getting out of town. When he learned from Jonathan that Saul is truly after your life, he's fleeing. He's running. And where does David go? He goes to the king Achish in Gath. Do you remember anything about Gath? It's a city of the Philistines. It's on the coast west of where David was. And another ironic detail, it's hometown to Goliath. I hope you get the picture. Here's David running to Goliath's hometown with Goliath's sword. David, what are you thinking? I can imagine a lot of places to run, but why are you running here, David? I know you're a good soldier. I know you're a smart guy. And I know the Lord is with you, and I know you're anointed, but why are you going to Gath? I think it shows his desperation. Is it too much to say panic? Is it too much to say that David is not thinking clearly or wound up tight? Or again, we don't want to read too much in the story. We don't have divine commentary on the story. But the Lord gave us the story, and he wants us to look at it and learn. So David goes to Gath, makes himself known in the city, and I suppose that David is hoping to just blend in, just look like a random Israelite on the street. Saul will never find me here. But David's wrong. The servants of the king in Gath say, we know this guy. Isn't he the king in Israel? We know this guy. Didn't the ladies in Israel and their victory chant about him? So David's name was not only great in Israel, it was great in Gath. And I think for good reason. You remember, he circumcised 200 dead Philistines to pay for his wife. You think they're going to forget that? He's one of the main generals for Saul. Do you think they don't have David's mugshot in the police station? So they know David, and David realizes they know me. And we do have a little commentary on David's emotions here in verse 12. It says he was greatly afraid, or he greatly feared. David's afraid. They want to kill me in Israel. I run to Gath to try to blend in. Now they know me, and no doubt they're going to kill me now. And so we see David's fear. Well, Saul was insane. David now pretends to be. And so when you look down at David, it says in verse 13, he disguised his sanity. He acted crazy. He became an actor. He did loony stuff. He took some random object and put graffiti on the walls. And as commentator Dale Ralph Davies says, more maintenance for the Gath Parks and Recreation as they clean up behind David's mess. And he lets himself slobber as if he doesn't have all his capacities. He acts like a crazy person. In some ways, it's ingenious. But in other ways, again, like when he was lying to the priest, to me, this is not a good look. This is the look of a man that's desperate, alone, acting like a guy with no sense, slobbering on himself. But the bottom line was, it worked. Because the king says, look, are we short on crazy people? Why should I take a crazy person from another country? We have enough. Call ICE, deport this foreigner. We don't need him. So they thought they were getting rid of a madman. Meanwhile, David's breathing a sigh of relief. In the world did I escape that one? Well, we're impressed with David's wit, but we're kind of wondering where his faith is. And I say again, discipleship involves blunders. I remember when I was a kid, we used to get the country magazine in the mail. It's kind of humorous to think back to it now, but it was this periodical magazine that would come in the mail, and it sort of celebrated rural life in America. It would be recipes and pictures from farms and photos of families and silly stories. And there was always a column at the back. Most embarrassing moment. And it would be this humorous country embarrassing moments. This is an embarrassing moment for David. Anointed of the king, killed Goliath, favorite in Israel. And he's drooling out the mouth down there in Gath. Where are you, David? I think it's encouraging when we see God's protection side by side with our foolishness. That's what this story means to me. Bad move on David. But God kept him. The slobber trick worked. He got out of town. There's something else we should not overlook. David didn't waste his dumb moments. We have two psalms that came out of this. Psalm 34 and Psalm 56 are products of his excursion to Gath. Psalm 34, a psalm of David when he feigned madness before Abimelech, who drove him away and he departed. He says, I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul will make its boast in the Lord. The humble will hear it and rejoice. Oh, magnify the Lord with me and let us exalt his name together. I sought the Lord and he answered me and he delivered me from all my fears. They looked to him and were radiant. Their faces will never be ashamed. This poor man cried and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and rescues them. I think it's very possible as David was penning the psalm, he was picturing the angels of the Lord encamping around his stupidity in Gath. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. How blessed is the man who takes refuge in him. Oh, fear the Lord, you his saints, for to those who fear him there is no want. The young lions do lack and suffer hunger, but they who seek the Lord shall not be in want of any good thing. Come, you children, listen to me. I will teach you the fear of the Lord. Who is the man who desires life and loves length of days that he may see good? Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. Depart from evil and do good. The eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous. He hears their cry. The face of the Lord is against the evildoers. And David goes on. David took his weak moments and learned from them. David penned a psalm out of his dark days. Psalm 56 for the choir director according to the Jonath Elhem Rehokim, a Miktam of David when the Philistines seized him in Gath. Be gracious to me, O God, for man has trampled upon me. Fighting all day long, he oppresses me. My foes have trampled upon me all day long, for they are many who fight proudly against me. When I am afraid, I will put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise. In God I have put my trust. I shall not be afraid. What can mere man do to me? All day long they distort my words. All their thoughts are against me for evil. They attack, they lurk, they watch my steps as they have waited to take my life. Because of wickedness, cast them forth. In anger, put down the peoples, O God. You have taken account of my wanderings. Put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? Then my enemies will turn back on the day when I call. This I know, that God is for me. In God whose word I praise. In the Lord whose word I praise. In God I have put my trust. I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? Your vows are binding upon me, O God. I will render thank offerings to you. For you have delivered my soul from death. Indeed, my feet from stumbling, so that I may walk before God in the land of the living. Don't these psalms just come to life? When you picture David reflecting on what just happened? People, God is kind. He's merciful. I'm not putting blessing on your foolish moments, but I'm saying they're part of the path of discipleship. Learn from them. Let your mistakes and your blunders push you toward the Lord. Go write your own psalms when you fall on your face. Third point in the sermon, living in a cave. Chapter 22, verse 1. So David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. So David breathes a sigh of relief, marvels how in the world he squeaked through that one, goes right back to Israel. And almost certainly he was aware of this cave, and so he goes there. And don't miss the picture. David's alone. Yeah, I know later on in the verse, his family comes down, but that's only after they hear of it. So I'm imagining it's days that David's sitting in this cave. Hours pass. There's no Wi-Fi in the cave of Adullam. David's in the cave with David. David's in the cave with David's fumbles. It's just David and Yahweh in the cave. And in fact, more psalms come from David during this time. You can turn to Psalm 57 and Psalm 142. There may not have been entertainment in the cave, but again, David's heart was working during those times. Psalm 57 says, for the choir director, when he fled from Saul in the cave. Verse 1, be gracious to me, O God, be gracious to me, for my soul takes refuge in you. And in the shadow of your wings, I will take refuge until destruction passes by. I will cry to God Most High, to God who accomplishes all things for me. He will send from heaven and save me. He reproaches him who tramples upon me. God will send forth his loving kindness and his truth. My soul is among lions. I must lie among those who breathe forth fire, even the sons of men whose teeth are spears and arrows and their tongue a sharp sword. Be exalted above the heavens, O God. Let your glory be above all the earth. They have prepared a net for my steps. My soul is bowed down. They dug a pit before me. They themselves have fallen into the midst of it. My heart is steadfast, O God, my heart is steadfast. I will sing, yes, I will sing praises. Awake, my glory, awake, harp and lyre. I will awaken the dawn. I will give thanks to you, O Lord, among the peoples. I will sing praises to you among the nations, for your loving kindness is great to the heavens and your truth to the clouds. Be exalted above the heavens, O God. Let your glory be above all the earth. David, if you're going to run to Nob and if you're going to play Madman in Gath, thank you for writing Psalm 57 for us. Do you see? I think David was learning in the cave. David went to Sunday school in the cave. David had some prayer time in the cave. Psalm 142, another psalm from David during this time. I cry aloud with my voice to the Lord. I make supplication with my voice to the Lord. I pour out my complaint before him. When my spirit was overwhelmed within me, you knew my path. In the way where I walk, they have hidden a trap for me. Look to the right and see, for there is no one who regards me. There is no escape for me. No one cares for my soul. I cried out to you, O Lord. I said, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Give heed to my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are too strong for me. Bring my soul out of prison, so that I may give thanks to your name. The righteous will surround me, for you will deal bountifully with me. Psalm 142 has cave dust on it. This is what it looks like to walk with the Lord. We say that we know it's not a bed of roses following Jesus, but we don't picture scenes like this in our life. We all know, okay, yes, I must suffer for Christ. But we normally don't plan desperate camping trips in the cave where it's just us and the Lord. But that's where David was. And in a bit, his family heard of his location, and so they come down. The king wants to kill David. No doubt they're under duress, they're under pressure, they're under Saul's target to at least find out where David is, if not harm him. So they want to be safe, so they go to find David. And then in verse 2, it's more than just family. There's multiple people who are in social and economic problems that are faced with difficulty. And so they join Team David. And so God is building him into a leader. We don't know how long they were in this cave. And I like to imagine if it was days, if it was weeks, as people started trickling to him, family started trickling to him. Maybe David even told them about the crazy story in Gath. I mean, somebody had to write it down. Maybe David explained to them and taught them. Again, we don't know. But there is this fascinating reference in 2 Samuel 23 where it's rehearsing David's mighty men. And it says in verse 13 of 2 Samuel 23 that 3 of the 30 chief men went down and came to David in the harvest time to the cave of Adullam while the troop of the Philistines was camping in the valley of Rephaim. David was in the stronghold while the garrison of the Philistines was then in Bethlehem. David had a craving and said, "Oh, that someone would give me water to drink from the well of Bethlehem, which is by the gate." So the 3 mighty men broke through the camp of the Philistines, drew water from the well of Bethlehem, which was by the gate, took it and brought it to David. Nevertheless, he would not drink it, but poured it out before the Lord. And he said, "Be it far from me, O Lord, that I should do this. Shall I drink the blood of the men who are in jeopardy of their lives?" Therefore, he would not drink it. A little window into the fun stuff that happened in the cave. David homesick, away from his wife, longing one day that could taste some of that good water back at Bethlehem. And some of David's loyal men did a daring raid and brought David a drink of water. David said, "I'm not taking it. This is their life." And he poured it out to the Lord. This is a window of this season of David's life, of David's devotion to the Lord, and of David winning the hearts of these men. They saw David loves us and David loves God. I want to point something else out to you in this passage. God's wonderful providence. You see in verses 3 and 4 that David is trying to find a place for his family. I'm sure he's got sister-in-laws and nieces and nephews. And running around in the mountains from Saul is no place for kids. So he goes to Moab to try to find a safe spot for his family. You want to guess why he likely went to Moab? Great-great-grandmother Ruth was a Moabitess. So David had some Moabite lineage in his genes. And to me, this is another picture of God's grace. Who'd have thought it? Only God works this stuff out. That here's a place for David's family to stay that's tied back to Naomi and Elimelech and the famine and the whole Ruth story. God's grace weaves the story of our lives together, even over generations. Who knows what sort of kindness is in your life right now that can be connected back to prayers or obedience of believers decades ago. I want to point out another grace from God, verse 5. David gets words from the Lord. The prophet comes and says, don't stay here. Now, I don't think the stronghold is the cave because David is in the stronghold. And the prophet says, leave the stronghold and go home. And the cave was in Israel. It was in Judah. So Gad sending David home indicates to me that the stronghold where he was staying was outside the country. I would guess Moab because that's where he just was with his family. But either way, the point is God sent his word to his people. God was so kind to give David simple direction. To me, it's a token of grace. After some blunders, after days and weeks of fear, after David crying and praying and writing psalms, the Lord is so kind to give him some direction. And God does that for us as well. David might have been thinking, Lord, why didn't you give me a prophet when I was running? Why didn't you give me Gad when I was freaking out and trying to figure out what to do down in Gath? We may never know the answer to why the Lord leads us the way he does, but he does lead us. At the end of the season, at the end of our text, David gets direction. I think we can all identify with this. We go through dark nights. We go through painful valleys. We feel like we can't even breathe. We come out on the other side and there's a word from the Lord waiting on us. There's a direction for us. We should praise the Lord for that.